The moment I read those 8 words, I realized I had not been invited to my granddaughter's wedding as family. I had been invited as a wallet. My name is Helen Carter. I am 74 years old, a widow, a grandmother, and until that afternoon, I believed I was one of the happiest women in America. The wedding venue sat on a beautiful vineyard just outside Napa Valley. Rows of white chairs stretched across a perfectly manicured lawn. Fresh flowers lined the aisle. Crystal chandeliers hung beneath a massive reception tent. Everywhere I looked, there was elegance, beauty, and evidence of careful planning. Much of that planning had been funded by me. I did not mind. Not at first. Emily was my only granddaughter. I had adored her from the moment I first held her in my arms 28 years earlier. When she called 18 months before the wedding and tearfully explained that her dream ceremony exceeded her budget, I did not hesitate. I wanted her day to be special. I wanted her to have memories she would cherish forever. So I wrote checks. One for the venue, another for the catering, another for the photographer. Then came the flowers, the musicians, the transportation, the rehearsal dinner, and eventually even part of the honeymoon. Every time another expense appeared, I reminded myself that family mattered more than money. Standing outside the reception tent that afternoon, I felt proud. Proud of Emily. Proud of the beautiful event she had created. Proud that I could help make it happen. Guests arrived wearing elegant dresses and tailored suits. Laughter floated through the warm California air. Waiters carried trays of sparkling beverages. The entire scene looked like something from a magazine. As I approached the seating area, a young event coordinator greeted me with a smile and handed me a place card. "Your table assignment, ma'am." I thanked her and glanced down. At first, I thought I had misread it. Then I looked again. Printed neatly beneath my assigned seat number were the words, "The old lady who's paying for everything." For several seconds, I simply stared. The sounds around me seemed to fade into the background. Conversations became distant. Music became muffled. My eyes remained fixed on those 8 words. The old lady who's paying for everything. I turned the card over, expecting to find some explanation. There was none. I checked the front again. The words remained there. Clear. Intentional. Impossible to misunderstand. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Not anger. Not immediately. It felt more like disbelief. Surely this had to be some mistake. Some printing error. Some misunderstanding. I looked around, searching for someone from the wedding staff. Before I could move, I noticed something unexpected. 2 guests standing several feet away suddenly looked away when our eyes met. Another guest shifted uncomfortably and pretended to check her phone. A woman I vaguely recognized from Emily's bridal shower gave me a sympathetic smile. Not a confused smile. A sympathetic one. That was the moment something inside me changed. If this had been an accident, people would have looked puzzled. Instead, they looked embarrassed. Embarrassed for me. Slowly, I slipped the place card into my purse. Then I lifted my head and forced a smile onto my face. Years of life experience had taught me one important lesson. When people think they have humiliated you, they often become careless. They stop hiding things. They assume you will either never notice or never respond. I was not ready to respond yet. First, I wanted answers. As guests continued filing into the reception area, I began paying closer attention than I ever had before. And before the ceremony was even over, I would discover that the name tag was only the beginning. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emily walked down the aisle beneath an arch covered in white roses while a string quartet played softly in the background. Guests smiled. Some wiped away tears. From a distance, everything appeared perfect. I sat quietly in my assigned seat and applauded along with everyone else. Yet my attention kept drifting away from the ceremony and toward the people around me. Once I started paying attention, I noticed things I had missed before. Every time someone approached me, there was a strange hesitation in their expression. A few guests seemed overly polite, almost as if they felt sorry for me. Others avoided conversation altogether. During the cocktail hour, I wandered through the reception area carrying a glass of sparkling water. Everywhere I went, conversations seemed to stop just before I arrived. Then they resumed once I walked away. At first I told myself I was imagining it. Weddings make people emotional. Perhaps I was being overly sensitive after what happened with the place card. But then another moment caught my attention. Near the dessert table, I overheard 2 women speaking quietly. I did not recognize either of them. One glanced toward me and lowered her voice. The other shook her head and said, "I still cannot believe they actually did that." Before I could hear anything else, they noticed me standing nearby and immediately changed the subject. My stomach tightened. They were not discussing the weather. They were not discussing the flowers. They were discussing me. Later, as guests gathered for photographs, I spotted Emily laughing with several bridesmaids. She looked radiant and carefree. Seeing her smile reminded me why I had agreed to help pay for so much in the first place. I loved her. I had always loved her. When her parents divorced during her teenage years, I was the one who attended every school recital and graduation ceremony. When she struggled through college, I quietly helped with tuition. When she lost her first job, I covered her rent for 3 months. Never once had I viewed those things as sacrifices. That is what family does. Family helps. Family shows up. Family protects one another. Yet standing there among hundreds of guests, I could not ignore a growing question. Had Emily ever seen me as anything more than a source of support? The thought hurt more than I wanted to admit. As the afternoon continued, small details kept piling up. The wedding program listed dozens of people who had contributed to making the event possible. Event planners, designers, florists, sponsors from local businesses. My name was nowhere to be found. During a conversation with one of the vendors, I learned that several guests believed Emily's parents had funded most of the wedding themselves. That surprised me because they had contributed only a small portion compared to what I had provided. I did not need public recognition. I never had. But the contrast between reality and what people believed felt increasingly deliberate. Then came another strange moment. While passing near the bridal suite, I heard laughter from behind a partially open door. One voice belonged to Emily's mother, Karen. The other sounded like one of the bridesmaids. I was not trying to eavesdrop, but as I walked past, I clearly heard someone say, "At least she is good for something." More laughter followed. The words hit me harder than I expected. I continued walking without stopping. By then, the uneasy feeling I had carried all afternoon was becoming impossible to ignore. Something was wrong. Not with the wedding itself. With the people behind it. The place card was not an isolated joke. It was part of something larger. A private narrative that many people seemed to understand except me. As the sun began sinking lower over the vineyard and guests prepared for the reception, I made a decision. I would stop assuming the best and start paying attention to the truth. Because whatever was happening around me, I was beginning to suspect it had been happening for much longer than a single day. As guests settled into the reception tent and the first course was served, my thoughts drifted back over the previous 18 months. Once I started connecting the dots, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. The wedding had not become expensive overnight. It had grown one request at a time. When Emily first announced her engagement, she sat across from me at my kitchen table with tears of happiness in her eyes. She showed me photos of a small vineyard wedding she had found online and admitted that it was probably beyond her budget. I remember reaching across the table and squeezing her hand. "Let me help," I told her. The gratitude on her face seemed genuine. A week later, I paid the deposit on the venue. A month after that came the florist, then the photographer, then a luxury shuttle service to transport guests from nearby hotels. Every request came wrapped in the same language. It was always described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Something special. Something meaningful. I never objected because I wanted Emily to have everything she dreamed of. Looking back, I realized something unsettling. The requests rarely came from Emily alone. More often, they came after conversations with her mother, Karen. Karen had always possessed a talent for making expensive ideas sound reasonable. "You do not want Emily settling for less on her big day," she would say. Or, "You know how much this would mean to her." At the time, those comments seemed harmless. Now they sounded different in my memory. As the months passed, the budget expanded far beyond the original plan. The guest list nearly doubled. The menu became more elaborate. The floral arrangements became larger. Even the rehearsal dinner was upgraded to a private event at an upscale restaurant overlooking the valley. Every time costs increased, someone would reassure me that the wedding would be unforgettable. They were right about that. Sitting beneath the reception tent, I quietly watched Emily move from table to table greeting guests. She looked happy. Yet another memory surfaced. About 6 months earlier, I had attended a planning lunch with Emily and Karen. During the meal, Karen casually joked that I should be given honorary sponsor status because I seemed to be funding half the wedding. Everyone laughed, including me. At the time, I assumed it was harmless teasing. Now I wondered whether it had been a glimpse of something more honest. Another memory followed. 3 months before the wedding, Emily called asking whether I could contribute toward a luxury honeymoon package in Italy. She sounded embarrassed when she asked, and I admired her for that. I agreed because I wanted her to start married life with wonderful memories. Yet only a week later, I saw social media photos of Karen showing friends pictures of the honeymoon and describing it as a gift from the family. Not from me, from the family. The distinction seemed small back then. It felt much larger now. As these memories accumulated, a painful realization began forming. Nobody had forced me to spend the money. Every decision had been mine. But somewhere along the way, appreciation had quietly transformed into expectation. The support I offered had stopped feeling like a gift and started being treated like an obligation. That was what hurt most. Not the money, the assumption, the belief that I would always say yes because that was simply my role. As dessert arrived and laughter echoed throughout the tent, I noticed Emily checking her phone near the dance floor. Karen stepped beside her and showed her something on the screen. Both women smiled. Then they laughed together. It was an ordinary moment. Yet for reasons I could not explain, I felt a chill despite the warm evening air. My instincts were telling me that there was still something I had not seen. Something important. And before the night was over, that hidden piece of the puzzle was finally going to reveal itself. The answer arrived when I least expected it. The reception was in full swing. Guests filled the dance floor, while waiters moved between tables carrying dessert plates and coffee. I excused myself from a conversation and stepped outside the tent for a few moments of fresh air. The evening sky glowed with shades of gold and pink above the vineyard. For the first time all day, the noise faded enough for me to think clearly. As I walked along a stone pathway beside the reception area, I noticed a small lounge space set up for the bridal party. A few purses and personal items had been left unattended on a nearby table. I had no interest in anyone else's belongings, but as I passed, a phone resting near the edge of the table suddenly lit up with a new message notification. The screen was visible for only a second, yet what I saw stopped me in my tracks. The message preview displayed a group chat title I recognized from previous wedding discussions. Beneath it appeared a sentence that made my heart sink. Did Grandma see the card yet? I stared at the screen. Before I could process what I had read, another message appeared. She probably thinks it was a mistake. Then another. Honestly, it is kind of true, though. My chest tightened. I knew I should keep walking. I knew the phone was not mine. But the damage had already been done. Those few words confirmed what I had been trying to deny all day. The place card was not an accident. It was intentional. More importantly, multiple people knew about it. I stepped away before anyone noticed me standing there. My hands felt strangely cold despite the warm evening air. For months, I had convinced myself that every contribution I made came from a place of love and mutual respect. Now I was beginning to understand that some people viewed my generosity very differently. Back inside the reception tent, I watched Emily laughing with her friends. She looked relaxed, comfortable, not like someone worried that her grandmother had been publicly humiliated. I wanted to believe she was innocent. I wanted to believe Karen had orchestrated everything without her knowledge. But the message I had seen made that increasingly difficult. As the evening continued, more pieces began falling into place. A bridesmaid approached me near the coffee station and awkwardly thanked me for helping create such a beautiful wedding. The way she emphasized the word helping sounded unusual, almost apologetic. Later, one of Emily's college friends accidentally referred to me as the sponsor before immediately correcting herself. Each comment was small, yet together they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being Helen. I had become a role, a financial resource, a dependable source of funding whose feelings were apparently less important than her checkbook. The realization hurt more than the original insult. Money can be replaced. Trust cannot. As speeches began later that evening, I sat quietly listening while family members praised love, commitment, and gratitude. The irony was difficult to miss. Several people spoke about generosity and support. Not one mentioned the person who had quietly funded much of what surrounded them. Again, I did not need public praise. What I wanted was respect. And respect was becoming increasingly difficult to find. Then, just as I was beginning to think the night could not surprise me any further, an unexpected conversation near the head table revealed something that changed everything. In a single moment, I Finally learned how Emily and Karen had been talking about me when they believed I would never hear a word. The conversation happened so casually that I do not think either of them realized how much damage their words would do. I was returning from the restroom when I passed behind a decorative partition near the head table. On the other side, I recognized Karen's voice immediately. She was speaking to one of her close friends. I had no intention of listening, but then I heard my name. That made me stop. Honestly, none of this would have happened without Helen, Karen said. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Perhaps she was finally acknowledging the truth. Then she laughed. She loves feeling needed. You just tell her it is for family, and she reaches for her checkbook. Several people chuckled. My stomach dropped. Another woman asked whether I felt overwhelmed by all the wedding expenses. Karen's answer came without hesitation. Not at all. She practically insisted on paying. We learned a long time ago that saying no to her generosity is impossible. More laughter followed. I stood frozen behind the partition. What hurt was not the joke itself. It was the complete absence of gratitude. The way they discussed me made it sound as though my support was some predictable financial resource rather than an act of love. Then came the comment that changed everything. One of the women asked whether Emily felt guilty accepting so much help. Karen laughed again. Emily says Grandma would probably pay for the next wedding too if someone asked nicely. The group erupted in laughter. Emily says. Not Karen believes. Not Karen assumes. Emily says. Those two words echoed inside my mind. Emily had participated in these conversations. Emily knew. Emily understood exactly how I was being discussed. Suddenly, dozens of confusing moments from the previous year made sense. The constant requests. The casual assumptions. The growing sense that my contributions were expected rather than appreciated. I quietly walked away before anyone noticed me. By the time I returned to my table, something inside me had changed. The sadness was still there, but it was no longer mixed with uncertainty. I finally understood the situation clearly. I was not dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with entitlement. As guests enjoyed cake and champagne, I sat alone for several minutes and reflected on my late husband, Richard. Richard had spent 40 years building our family business. He often said that gratitude was the foundation of every strong relationship. Without gratitude, generosity eventually turns into obligation. At the time, I thought I fully understood what he meant. Sitting there at my granddaughter's wedding, I realized I had only understood it intellectually. Now I understood it personally. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated inside my purse. The screen displayed the name of my attorney, Michael Lawson. We had spoken briefly earlier that week regarding an unrelated trust matter. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Helen, he said warmly. I hope the wedding is going well. I looked toward the dance floor where Emily and her new husband were smiling for photographs. Actually, Michael, I said quietly, I think I need to make some changes. There was a brief pause. What kind of changes? I watched Karen laughing with friends near the bar. I watched Emily accepting congratulations from guests. Neither woman seemed aware that anything had changed. The important kind, I replied. Michael immediately recognized the seriousness in my voice. Would you like to schedule a meeting? As soon as possible. Monday morning? Perfect. After we ended the call, I slipped my phone back into my purse. For the first time all day, I felt calm. Not because the hurt had disappeared. It had not. But because I finally knew what I was going to do next. While everyone around me celebrated the beginning of a new chapter, they had no idea that another chapter had just begun as well. And this one would not unfold the way they expected. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of music, speeches, and smiling faces. Outwardly, nothing had changed. I continued congratulating guests. I posed for photographs. I applauded during the first dance and smiled when people approached my table. Anyone looking at me from across the room would have assumed I was simply another proud grandmother enjoying a beautiful family celebration. Inside, however, I was reevaluating years of decisions. Richard and I had spent decades building a comfortable life. Neither of us came from wealth. We built everything through patience, long workdays, and careful planning. When the business succeeded, we made a promise to each other. We would use our resources to strengthen the family, but we would never allow money to replace character. For many years, I believed that promise was being honored. Now I was no longer certain. As I watched guests dancing beneath the chandeliers, I remembered a conversation Richard and I had shortly before he passed away. We were sitting on our back porch overlooking the lake behind our home. The sun was setting, and he had been reviewing documents related to our estate plan. At one point, he closed the folder and looked directly at me. "Helen," he said, "if the day ever comes when people value the money more than the relationship, promise me you will protect the relationship by protecting the money." At the time, I laughed because the statement sounded backward. He smiled and explained, "Sometimes people need boundaries more than they need gifts." Those words returned to me with surprising clarity as the wedding reception continued. For years, I had assumed generosity automatically strengthened family bonds. But generosity without accountability can create something else entirely. It can create entitlement. And entitlement slowly erodes gratitude until appreciation disappears altogether. The evidence was all around me. Nobody had thanked me publicly. Nobody had acknowledged my contributions honestly. Worse, some people seemed to view my support as a permanent obligation rather than a voluntary gift. By the end of the evening, I realized this was not really about a wedding. The wedding simply exposed a deeper problem that had existed for years. Around 10 o'clock, guests began preparing for the final events of the evening. The atmosphere remained festive. Emily and her new husband looked happy. I genuinely wanted that happiness for them. Despite everything I had discovered, I still loved my granddaughter. Love was never the issue. Respect was. Respect had quietly disappeared somewhere along the way. Before leaving, I stepped outside once more. The vineyard was peaceful beneath the night sky. Strings of lights glowed softly among the vines. Laughter drifted from the reception tent behind me. For several minutes, I stood alone and allowed myself to feel the disappointment I had been suppressing all day. Not anger. Disappointment. There is a difference. Anger seeks immediate reaction. Disappointment seeks understanding. I finally understood what had happened. The people closest to me had become so accustomed to receiving that they no longer recognized the value of what they were receiving. That realization hurt deeply, but it also gave me clarity. On Monday morning, I would meet with Michael Lawson. We would review every trust, every planned gift, every inheritance provision, and every future distribution. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted alignment between values and rewards. Richard believed character mattered. I believed character mattered. It was time for our estate plan to reflect that belief more clearly. As I returned to the reception for the final farewell, I felt surprisingly peaceful. The difficult part was no longer deciding whether something was wrong. The difficult part was behind me. The truth had already revealed itself. What came next would simply be a response to that truth. And while everyone around me believed the story of this wedding had already been written, they had no idea the most important chapter was still waiting to begin. Monday morning arrived with remarkable clarity. While most people were probably recovering from the excitement of the wedding weekend, I found myself sitting across from Michael Lawson in his office overlooking downtown San Francisco. Sunlight streamed through the windows as he reviewed several folders spread neatly across the conference table. Michael had worked with Richard and me for nearly 20 years. More importantly, he understood the values behind our estate plan, not just the numbers. After listening carefully to everything that had happened at the wedding, he remained silent for several moments. Finally, he folded his hands and asked a simple question. "Helen, what outcome are you hoping to achieve?" It was not the question I expected. I had arrived prepared to discuss legal documents and financial structures. Instead, he was asking about purpose. I thought about it carefully before answering. "I do not want revenge," I said. "I want accountability. I want the people who inherit from Richard and me to understand that generosity is not something they are entitled to. It is something they should appreciate." Michael nodded slowly. "That is a very different goal." For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every aspect of our estate plan. Some provisions had not been updated in years. Others reflected assumptions that no longer felt appropriate. As we worked through the documents, I found myself thinking less about money and more about character. Richard had always believed that inheritance should reinforce values, not replace them. Somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of that principle. By lunchtime, we had outlined several significant changes. Future distributions would no longer be automatic. Certain gifts would be redirected toward charitable projects Richard had cared deeply about. Educational funds for future generations would remain protected, but large discretionary inheritances would now be connected to demonstrated responsibility, contribution, and respect. Nothing was being taken away unfairly. Expectations were simply being realigned with values. For the first time since the wedding, I felt completely at peace. Over the following weeks, life returned to normal on the surface. Emily and her husband shared honeymoon photographs from Italy. Friends posted wedding pictures online. Family members exchanged messages about how beautiful the event had been. Meanwhile, I quietly finalized the revised documents. I did not announce my decisions. I did not threaten anyone. I did not seek confrontation. The changes were simply completed and filed properly. Then, about 6 weeks later, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Emily called and invited me to a family gathering celebrating the newlyweds' return home. Her tone sounded cheerful and completely unchanged. If she felt any guilt about what had happened at the wedding, she gave no indication of it. I accepted the invitation. On the evening of the gathering, relatives filled Karen's backyard. There were string lights, catered food, and plenty of conversation. Once again, everyone seemed eager to celebrate. As I greeted family members, I noticed something familiar. Several people treated me warmly, but their warmth felt transactional. They asked about my health, my travel plans, and my hobbies with unusual enthusiasm. After everything I had learned, the pattern was difficult to miss. About an hour into the evening, Karen approached with a bright smile. "Helen, everyone would love it if you said a few words." The request immediately caught my attention. During the wedding, nobody had seemed particularly interested in hearing from me. Now, suddenly, a microphone was being placed in my hands. I accepted it politely. Conversations gradually quieted. Faces turned toward me. Emily smiled from across the patio. Karen stood nearby, looking pleased with herself. I glanced around at the gathered family members and felt an unexpected sense of calm. They believed they knew exactly who I was. They believed they understood what role I would continue playing in their lives. In just a few moments, that assumption was about to be challenged for the very first time. I stood quietly for a moment holding the microphone while the conversations around the patio faded into silence. Dozens of familiar faces looked toward me. Some were smiling politely. Others appeared curious. Emily sat beside her husband near the center of the gathering. Karen stood nearby with a confident expression, clearly expecting a few sentimental remarks about marriage and family. In many ways, I think everyone expected the same thing. They expected gratitude. They expected encouragement. They expected the dependable version of Helen Carter they had always known. I smiled warmly and began speaking. "First, I want to congratulate Emily and Daniel on the beginning of their new life together." Applause followed. Emily smiled. I smiled back. Everything felt perfectly normal. "Hey, wedding is more than a celebration," I continued. "It is also an opportunity to reflect on the values that help a family remain strong for generations." Several people nodded. Karen looked pleased. I could almost see her relaxing as the speech unfolded. Then I reached into my purse and removed a small folded card. The same card I had carried since the wedding day. "A few weeks ago," I said calmly, "I attended a beautiful wedding that brought our family together." More smiles appeared. Nobody sensed what was coming next. During that celebration, I discovered something that taught me an important lesson. I unfolded the card and held it up. A few people leaned forward. Emily's smile faded slightly. Karen's expression tightened. This was my place card. Silence spread across the patio. I read the words aloud exactly as they had been printed. The reaction was immediate. Several guests looked visibly uncomfortable. Others glanced toward Emily and Karen. The air seemed to shift all at once. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I simply allowed the words to exist in the open. For the first time, they belonged to everyone instead of remaining hidden behind private jokes and whispered conversations. Emily stared at the table in front of her. Karen's face lost its confident expression. I continued speaking gently. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Later, I learned it was not. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. What hurt was not the joke itself. What hurt was realizing that generosity had become expected instead of appreciated. The silence deepened. I could see people processing what they were hearing. My late husband taught me that family relationships should be built on respect, gratitude, and character. Over the past several weeks, I have spent a great deal of time reflecting on those values. I paused briefly before reaching into my purse once again. This time, I removed a sealed envelope. As part of that reflection, I met with my attorney and completed a comprehensive review of our estate plans and future family gifts. Several heads turned immediately. The atmosphere changed again. This was no longer simply a speech. The revised documents have already been finalized, I said calmly. Future distributions from my estate will now be based not only on family connections, but also on demonstrated character, responsibility, gratitude, and contribution to others. No names were mentioned. No one was singled out. Yet everyone understood the significance of what I was saying. This decision was not made out of anger. It was made out of clarity. Money should support good values. It should never replace them. I looked directly at Emily. My voice remained soft. I love my family very much. That has never changed. But love and accountability can exist together. Tears appeared in Emily's eyes. Karen remained completely silent. Around the patio, guests sat motionless. There was no dramatic confrontation, no argument, no raised voices, just truth spoken calmly and publicly. After a few more words of congratulations for the newlyweds, I thanked everyone for listening and handed the microphone back. The gathering eventually resumed, but the atmosphere was different. Conversations became quieter. Smiles became more thoughtful. And for the first time since the wedding day, I felt completely free. The burden I had carried for weeks was finally gone. The truth was no longer hidden. Everyone had heard it. Everyone understood it. And now the consequences would unfold naturally from there. The months that followed revealed something interesting about human nature. Once the excitement faded and daily life returned, people began showing me who they truly were. Some relatives avoided me entirely. Others reached out with sudden enthusiasm, asking how I was doing and suggesting lunches or family visits that had never seemed important before. I listened politely, but I also paid attention. For the first time in years, I stopped measuring relationships by what I could give and started measuring them by what genuinely existed when giving was no longer guaranteed. The difference was remarkable. A few weeks after the gathering, Emily called and asked if we could meet. Her voice sounded different from the confident tone I remembered from before the wedding. There was hesitation, uncertainty. We agreed to have lunch at a small restaurant near the waterfront. When I arrived, she was already seated at a corner table. For several moments, neither of us knew quite how to begin. Finally, Emily looked down at her hands and spoke. "Grandma, I have replayed that wedding day in my head more times than I can count." I remained silent and allowed her to continue. "I should have stopped it," she said quietly. "Even if I did not create the joke, I knew about it. I knew it was wrong." Hearing those words did not erase the hurt, but it mattered that she said them. True accountability begins with honesty. For the next hour, we talked more openly than we had in years. Emily admitted that she had become accustomed to my support, not because she deliberately wanted to use me, but because everyone around her treated my generosity as something permanent and expected. Over time, she stopped questioning that assumption. "I never realized how disrespectful it had become," she said. "Not until you held up that card." I appreciated the apology, but more importantly, I appreciated the self-awareness behind it. By the end of lunch, I felt something I had not expected. Hope, not because everything had been fixed. Trust takes time to rebuild, but because growth was finally possible. Karen, on the other hand, never offered an apology. She sent a brief message saying she regretted that my feelings had been hurt, which was very different from accepting responsibility. Oddly enough, that no longer bothered me. One of the most valuable lessons I learned through this experience was that not everyone chooses growth. Some people choose comfort instead, and that decision belongs to them. Nearly a year after the wedding, I found myself sitting on the same porch where Richard and I had shared so many conversations. The lake shimmered beneath the evening sun. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Beside me sat a framed photograph from Emily's wedding. Not because I had forgotten what happened, but because I had decided not to let one painful moment erase a lifetime of memories. Looking back, I realized the greatest gift from that experience had nothing to do with money. The true gift was clarity. Clarity about relationships. Clarity about boundaries. Clarity about the difference between love and obligation. The estate plan remained exactly as I had revised it. The principles behind it remained unchanged. Character mattered. Gratitude mattered. Respect mattered. Those values would continue guiding every important decision I made. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the water, I thought about the card that had caused so much pain. Ironically, the people who created it believed they were making a joke. Instead, they gave me something far more valuable. They gave me the truth. And once you finally see the truth, you are free to build the rest of your life around it. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace.